Bosses of Reddit, have you ever seriously regretted firing someone, and if so, why? Story 1. I had an assistant for about a year, who was a pretty good assistant for a difficult working situation. My boss, the district manager, hated him though. She kept trying to catch him screwing up when I wasn't around. The trouble was, the company paid poorly, so talent was hard to come by. Training was difficult, and the hours were 48 a week minimum. This guy was the only assistant I had who didn't quit in less than a year. My stores were so undermanned, if this guy left, I'd be working 80-hour weeks like before I got him. The only reason it wasn't more than 80 hours was because the stores, malls, or shopping centers actually closed at night. Finally, one day she wrote him up because she said, a secret shopper said he was picking his nose. This guy, who at least had some dignity, refused to sign the disciplinary paperwork. I want proof I am not sitting in the showroom picking my nose. My boss said he won't sign it. Insubordination. Fire him. I really tried to reason with her, but she wanted him gone one way or another. Either you fire him or I'll come in and fire both of you. I had to fire a man for picking his nose. I quit shortly after that because I knew this was just the lowest I'd ever sunk in management. I still feel bad about all that. That sounds like an unfair dismissal, as differentiated from wrongful termination suit to me. You can fire someone for any reason or no reason, as long as it's not a protected reason. But if they take you to court and you don't have anything to substantiate whatever reason you gave them, that could constitute unfair dismissal. They can say, this person is lying to the court about the true reasons for my termination, and the employer gets in a lot of hot water if they can't substantiate whatever claim led to dismissal if they repeated the claim in court. Story 2. A long time ago, I was asked to fire a salesman. He was kind, but not good at selling. It was a week before Christmas. I told my boss I would fire him January 3rd. Boss said no and fired him that day. I regretted not giving him the holiday. I would rather get fired before so I can save money. I had a boss fire me after a very big vacation. I found out later the company was going to fire me 3 weeks earlier, but he knew I had this huge trip planned and wanted me to have fun. I go spend $5K and come home to be fired, LOL. This was 20 years ago, so $5K was a pretty big deal. For anyone curious, I was fired for accidentally finding out my coworker made $4K more a year. The secretary accidentally put my pay stub on his desk and his on mine. I made a complaint to HR and asked for a 3-year plan to eventually make me whole with him while adding 3% raise each year. Literally from that point on, everything I did became poor quality. I learned HR was for the company and not the employees. Story 3. Many years ago, I was a low-level HR employee and was asked to fire someone over the phone. It was horrible. She was a project manager. I had done her interviewing / onboarding recruitment coordination and really liked her. But her manager said she wasn't working out. They'd tried many times to help guide her in the right direction, but it just wasn't happening. I'd never let anyone go before, and I was very nervous. She worked at a location hours away from mine, so it wasn't feasible for me to make the drive to meet her in person, and had to call her on the phone to fire her. I had my boss sit in on the call, which was the right decision because a minute or so into the call, my voice and my brain just stopped communicating because my nerves were completely shot. My boss jumped in to make sure all the legal basics were covered, like let go for cause and effective immediately, because I literally couldn't speak at all. It was made all the worse because the employee herself seemed genuinely blindsided, despite the manager's insistence that they'd tried coaching her repeatedly. This was like 6-7 years ago, and I still think about her with relative frequency. Objectively, she should be a blip on my radar given my career history since then, and I know that there was little I could have done in the moment to soften the blow of her losing her job, but I still hate that her offboarding experience was so disjointed because I completely malfunctioned and had to defer to my boss. 4 years ago, I got a call from a competing engineering company. They screwed up a job and, rather than own up, decided to blame a senior technologist as the scapegoat. His immediate boss was against it, but the partners demanded it. He phoned us and said, you should hire this guy. We did, and he was an excellent employee until he retired 20 years later. Our gain, their loss. The best part is that the guy who called me, who was a senior engineer, quit shortly thereafter, and the company closed down a couple years later. Karma, I guess. Story 5. The other side of the coin here, but I'm sure they regretted getting rid of me. I was an individual contributor at a fairly large organization that one day was pulled into that dreaded meeting with some random director and someone from HR. I come to find out that I'm being laid off effective immediately. They walk me to my desk, I gather my things, and I'm walked out of the building. A couple months go by and they realize that randomly stopped working. They narrowed it down to something I had worked on. This was costing them a ton of money, so they reached out to me. That is, a flurry of emails and a few phone calls before I was able to answer, asking for an explanation. Like, My guy, I don't know why stuff is not working. I haven't worked there for a few months. After telling them that I'll meet with the relevant teams and help figure it out for double my normal hourly rate, with a minimum of 2 weeks, I got to work. After hearing the issue, it became pretty obvious that some automation scripts I wrote weren't running anymore. I asked about it, and it turns out that another person that I collaborated with to set those scripts up also got cut. So the resource allocation for the server was just left to expire. I kept a backup in my account, so I told them that if they just access my backups, they should find it in there. They shouldn't be terribly difficult to implement. Well, it turns out that they deleted my shit after about a month, so it was gone. Yeah, good luck with that. That took me a while to put together and get just right. You're going to have to cobble something together to get it to work. Here's a rough idea of what you need to do to sort of get stuff running. Now pay me thanks. Story 6. I was, among other things, making most drawings for 3D printed parts for machines, either for testing before ordering metal ones or for lighter loads. ABS ones worked fine enough. My team leader left for another job. I couldn't stand the new leader nor the rest of people above, so I left 2 months later. Got a call from them later asking about some drawings they needed but couldn't find, said they were on my PC. To which I hear, well, a week after you left, the new team leader and some intern went through those and deleted the ones they thought weren't needed. What about the backup? They went through that too. Well, good luck then. Story 7. It sucked, but it was the correct thing to do. Dude was a good guy, a chill guy, but he was chill to the point of not doing the work, and it created extra work and pressure for everyone else. Counseled him, tried to break down the tasks he had and figure out how to get him up to snuff, but it was like he'd just lost interest in doing the work and was waiting out a clock. Finally, I had to put him on a PIP, which sucked. It had a specific outline of stuff he had to do. It was like a guidebook for how to keep his job because I wanted him to be successful because we'd worked together before doing different work and I knew he was a good guy, but it was like he just checked out. Finally, I had to fly up to his office and escort him to human resources for the meeting. It sucked. It was 20 years ago and I still think about it sometimes because it was just so goddamn avoidable. All he had to do was show up and meet his commitments, and his commitments were low-key and exactly what he'd signed up for when he applied to the position. He drifted into his next job, and we lost touch. I hope he's okay. I'm still upset by it because I've been laid off, and it's just so goddamn awful. Story 8. I had an employee about 4 years ago now who had chronic attendance issues. I kept her much longer than my boss was happy with because she was decent and very genuine. But eventually I just couldn't put it off anymore. When we were in the room talking, she burst into tears and looked terrified and told me her husband was not going to be happy with her. She said he wouldn't hurt her and she didn't need me to call the police for her. But even still, I'm worried. The level of terror was up there. Story 9. Thankfully, I have fired or been involved in firing people very rarely, and it was usually for a very clear cause. The only one for which I have some regret because I liked her as a person was Sally. Sally was a good worker, smart, hard-working, a quick study. But she was a tough person. While she had a good heart, she had almost no savoir-faire. She was very crude, had no sense whether or not a topic was appropriate to discuss at work or not, and very, very loud, both in face-to-face interactions and on phone calls to the point that it was distracting for the other people in the office. In an effort to try to salvage things, and because we were desperately understaffed, she was bounced around from manager to manager until she ended up with me. I really liked her, and we made a good team. Our strengths really complemented each other. But she had this habit of going to HR for every little slight, real, or perceived. Of course, because my company was litigation-averse to the extreme, HR had to check out every single thing she complained about. This was annoying and time-consuming for them. So about a year later, when we were appropriately staffed and our business was in a bit of a downturn, it was decided that Sally was going to be laid off, which was really just a nice way of firing her. She wasn't liked in the office at all. I was probably her only supporter by that point, and HR was tired of dealing with her shenanigans. I still felt bad about the whole thing because she was actually great at her job, was a huge help to me, and we worked well together. She was in her late 50s when she was let go, and we all know how tough it is to find another job at that age. She was unemployed for 2 years until she found another position. However, it ended up being a great fit for her, and she's still there now, 7 years later. Story 10. I was on the other side of this. I was a junior purchaser at a small company. Our head purchaser was leaving. Neither I or the other junior applied for the job. We knew what our department had made, and it was nowhere near enough to put up with what she put up with. That was why she was leaving. The company kept getting turned down by potential outside hires. I was asked in a performance review why I hadn't applied for the job, and I said as nicely as I could what I said above. I was fired the next day. A few months later, I got a call from the company. It was the guy they hired to lead purchasing after they fired me. They had gone back to a guy who had turned them down with a better offer after they had freed up some space in the budget. He had already been promoted to GM because the person that fired me was running the business into the ground. The new guy had seen the work I had done and only heard great things about me. He wanted me to come back to the company. I declined. It turned out to be a good decision. Story 11. I used to be the head teacher at a very big learning center a while back. Multiple centers in the city, around 30 plus. If anyone has to get fired, needed the center manager and head teacher to agreed upon. There's that one teacher who's very confrontational with everyone, and all the kids are terrified of him. We lost 30 students since he started. He got transferred to our center for 7 months. We received a complaint from parents about the teacher pushing student to the floor. They threatened to file a lawsuit. When I asked him about it, he became defensive and extremely aggressive. Asked me to pull the footage through CCTV, which I did, and saw him nudge a 6-year-old to the floor. The kid was just trying to get into the classroom before class. Mind you, he's a big fella, and yes, he tried to stop the kid and may have used too much force in his actions. He begged me to help him out as he was facing eviction. The center offered accommodation for teachers from overseas, and he didn't get along well with his housemates. He got transferred to a new house after the previous ones filed complaints about him being untidy and unhygienic. I agreed and tried to help him. Next thing I know, he complained to HR about me inviting other people from the center, which I've known for 4 years and are all very close to each other, to my wedding, but him. He got on my nerve and told HR he can't stay with us anymore. He got evicted a week later, literally brought all his belonging in the classroom, and fired the day after. Story 12. About 20 years ago, I was running a bar Christmas Eve. Chaotic night as we were incredibly short-staffed due to heavy snow, and a lot of our workers being from a different area. Bar downstairs was closing up and staff being moved to the UB upstairs. We were pound 200 short in the bar, and the main manager interrogated 3 out of the 4. Conveniently, not the supervisor he was having an affair with. That supervisor was also in charge of the float and was generally her job. That float for 1 till was conveniently 200 pounds. Main boss wouldn't consider his fling could do wrong, a common occurrence, and he didn't want to deal with it. So it became me, lowest of 4 managers, to sack 3 people for suspected theft. On Christmas Eve, knowing I wasn't in any position financially, or in terms of job security to say no. Only joy was that his wife finally caught him eye the affair, and his whole life went to shit soon after. Story 13. Nope, there's a long process before it gets to that point, and almost nobody does get to that point. Except for the guy who got the job using fake identity papers. There was no long process to fire him. It went very, very fast once we found out. Reminds me of a guy I worked with for a brief period. Said he had his GED. The background check discovered that was a lie. According to what I heard, his mother told him he passed and he never bothered verifying. Story 14. I had to fire a friend. Someone had to go, and he was the least productive. We remained friends, and I gave him a great recommendation for his next job. Story 15 was the manager of a brew pub back in my mid-20s. It had just opened up, and the owners were really intense trying to get it profitable ASAP. I definitely took the abuse they hurled at me and passed it on to the staff. Not proud of it. Anyways, one server was pretty cutthroat and weaseled her way into an assistant manager role of sorts. She started bashing another server pretty hard and was constantly telling me what she was doing wrong. One thing led to another, and it ended up with her being written up for dumb stuff a few times, and finally, me firing her. Even at the time, I felt shitty about it. Looking back, I realized she was fine and didn't deserve it, especially since the stress of managing drove me back to just serving and bartending after I moved away. I had plenty of coworkers after that who were worse at playing restaurant than her. These days, I see posts from Anti-Work where restaurant managers are shit to their employees, and see myself in them and cringe so hard. I got laid off recently from my programming job, got out of restaurants eventually. First time being laid off, and part of me feels like it's karma for me firing that girl. Story 16. Someone else hired someone with no experience after I voted no. I knew he would be in over his head and he had a good job already. They didn't train him or coach him. And then, after about 6 months, my boss's boss come to me and tells me to build a case against him, my team member, and to fire him. I quit within the next 2 months. F them. I'm not doing their dirty work to solve a problem they caused and enable them to keep their hands clean in the process. Story 17. Had a underperforming employee, tried a PIP coaching, moving to a different job role with the team, eventually came to terms with not the right person for the job team terminated employee. A week later, her child dies in a house fire where they lost everything. I donated $1,000 to the GoFundMe, but still can't help but wonder if my termination set off the events that caused this. Story 18. Sometimes it takes up to 6 months to actually fire someone. If I've gone through the painful process that entire time, then the person doesn't deserve to have a job. As a boss, you're typically required to give numerous chances, along with tons of monitoring, coaching, and documenting. The whole process sucks, and so does the person I'm firing for making me go through all of that crap and never improving their performance. Story 19, I've never regretted it as there was always a good reason. But I can honestly say it's not fun, and every time I knew I was going to have to fire someone the night before, I was never able to sleep. But in the end, it's usually a relief. But at my company, it's pretty hard to actually get fired, so when you do have to do it, it's almost never out of the blue. Story 20. I was forced to fire a junior person on my team. My boss gave me no choice because she had used a competitor idea as inspiration, working in design. But it was our intermediary boss who told her to use the idea. I wish I would have taken a harder stand, but I was afraid of being fired myself. I was only a few months on the job. I still regret it to this day, but the other woman has had a good career, so that's a plus at least.